Good evening, everyone. This week's parsha is Parsha Shelach. This should be our learning together should be a merit for Shlema for those who need to be healed, and a merit that Hashem should rescue us from this very difficult situation that we and the entire world faces with COVID-19. Parsha Shelach deals with the spies, the story of the spies. Moshe Rabbeinu sent out spies to spy out the land of Israel before the Jewish people would enter. They came back with a very negative report. The Jewish people believed them, regretted leaving Egypt, didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. And because of that, Hashem decreed upon that generation that they would remain another 38 years, to be a total of 40 years in the desert, so that first generation that left Egypt would die. The next generation would enter the land of Eretz Yisrael. Drasha, in the beginning of this week's parsha, discusses the juxtaposition of this episode of the spies with the end of last week's parsha, which is the episode of Miriam speaking against her brother Moshe and the punishment that she suffered for it. And she suffered that punishment because of the fact that she spoke against Moshe, who was the greatest prophet. She criticized Moshe, who was the greatest prophet that we've ever had. And she was punished for criticizing Moshe and basically challenging or questioning the greatness of his prophecy against something that he had done. And Hashem chastised her for the fact that she doubted Moshe and criticized Moshe in light of the fact that he is that greatest prophet that at that time was and that we've ever had. And Rashi explains that the juxtaposition of these two episodes is that Miriam was punished for the lashon hara, for the bad speech, for speaking derogatorily about Moshe. The spies saw what happened to Miriam for speaking in a wrong fashion. They saw what happened to her, but they took no lesson from it, and they spoke against the land of Israel. So if they would have properly contemplated the episode of Miriam and realized the severity of speaking disparagingly, then that would have prevented them from sinning. But they didn't do that. They didn't take the lesson, and they eventually went on to criticize and to disparage the land of Israel, which they were punished for. The question is that it would seem that there's a very big difference between Miriam speaking against Moshe and the spies speaking against the land of Israel. And that is that Moshe is a person, land of Israel is an inanimate object. How does one make a comparison between the two? When you talk about the actual laws of lashon hara, the actual laws of speaking lashon hara, speaking gossip, evil speech, speaking negatively about someone that the Torah prohibits us from doing, that prohibition only applies to people. There's no prohibition speaking lashon hara about a land, including Eretz Yisrael. How were the spies supposed to learn a lesson from Miriam when Miriam was speaking about a human being and they were speaking about an inanimate object to whom there is no prohibition of speaking lashon hara, where to Moshe Rabbeinu there was? So how are they supposed to compare the two? There's such a vast difference between them. And the answer that I once saw is the following. You have to go back to that episode where Miriam speaks against Moshe, and we have to take note of one of the verses that the Torah tells us when the Torah is telling us that episode. The Torah tells us that Miriam spoke to Aaron against Moshe. And the Torah tells us there, V'ha'ish Moshe anav mikol adam. The man Moshe was the humblest of all men. What's the point of telling us that? And the Chavetz Chaim explains, the Torah is telling us that because it's trying to impress upon us that Moshe Rabbeinu was not slighted by what Miriam said. It didn't bother him. It wouldn't have bothered him. Whether he heard about it, didn't hear about it, Moshe Rabbeinu was not the person that would in the least bit be affected by what Miriam said. Which means that Miriam did not hurt Moshe in any way. So why was she punished? You know, when we talk about the laws of lashon hara, which means not to speak negatively about someone. So let's say you speak negatively about someone and, you tell someone about what someone else did that was wrong to do, but you have no constructive purpose for doing so. And the person says, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. And the person you spoke about in no way is affected by what you said. Have you spoken Lashon Hara? Have you committed the transgression of speaking Lashon Hara? The answer is yes. If your words would actually have affected or hurt the person you spoke about in some way, then you need to ask them forgiveness. But even if it doesn't happen, even if whatever you said had no effect on the person, no one believed it, nothing, it had no effect. You may not have to ask that person forgiveness, but you have to ask God for forgiveness. You have still transgressed the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara. Because even if the person you're speaking about isn't affected in any way, you're forbidden to speak negatively about another person. Now, in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu was unaffected. But the transgression of Miriam was, how could she disparage the greatest prophet? How could she in any way tear down the greatest prophet? This was something that God chastised her, and she should have realized before she criticized Moshe. But it's not about hurting Moshe's feelings. It's about understanding the greatness of Moshe, appreciating it, and therefore not being disparaging about it. That was the lesson behind what happened by Miriam. What happened by Miriam was she didn't affect Moshe. It's like she was talking to a rock from that point. But how could she tear down? How could she disparage someone as great as Moshe? That was a lesson that the spies could have used for themselves when it came to speaking about the land of Israel. The land of Israel was something they knew. Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, their forefathers dreamed about it. They were promised it. It was something that they looked up, that they were yearning for. It was something that Hashem spoke to Moshe, tell the Jewish people about when he came to take them out of Egypt. They knew how great and how important Eretz Yisrael was. So how do you tear it down? How do you speak negatively about it? This is the holiest land, the holiest place in the world. And that's how you talk about it, about a place that there's no way we can conquer it. The Canaanites are too strong. This is the special chosen land of God. How can you say that? So it wasn't about the technical transgression of speaking Lashon Hara. Because Moshe wasn't affected, and this was something very specific about Moshe. So technically there may not have been a transgression of Lashon Hara. I shouldn't say that. On Miriam's part, there was, because she spoke negatively about Moshe. But the point was not about the technical transgression as much as what did this transgression mean? What's the meaning behind it? What's the understanding behind it? The understanding is that someone, as Hashem said to Miriam, someone as great as Moshe, how could you talk down about him? How could you speak disparagingly about him? That lesson, that is something the spies could have taken for themselves while they were thinking about what to say about Eretz Yisrael. And there's no technical prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara about a piece of land. But how do you speak about Eretz Yisrael like that? You know how great Eretz Yisrael is. You know how much Eretz Yisrael is Hashem's place and how much He wanted to give it to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and to his descendants. How do you speak negatively about it? How can you do that? And that is the lesson that the spies should have taken from Miriam. When they saw it happen to Miriam for being disparaging about someone as great as Moshe, something as great as Moshe, they should have learned from that. How can they be disparaging about something as great as Eretz Yisrael? And when we do talk about the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara, which we know, as we said before, even if it has no effect on what the person you spoke about, you still have transgressed. Why? Because how do you talk about a fellow Jew like that? Even if what you're saying is true, you're still not allowed to say it. But it's true, he did it. So what? That's not what you're supposed to be focusing on when you think about your fellow Jew. You should be focusing on the positive. This person is a fellow Jew. How do you speak badly about him or her? How do you do that? The Torah is telling us that even if you don't hurt the person, you should have such respect and such honor for another fellow Jew that you would not speak badly about them. You wouldn't bring yourself to that point of actually expressing to someone else something disparaging about someone else. Don't focus on the negative. Focus on the positive. Focus on this person. Focus on this fellow Jew. That is what lies behind the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara. Don't focus on the negative. Realize the positive, inherent positive in every single person. And if you realize, then Torah is saying, focus on that. Don't focus on anything else. There are times where, for constructive purposes, we do have to speak negatively about people. That's all about studying the laws of Lashon Hara and knowing what to say, what not to say. But the prohibition is a prohibition that says that even if you don't hurt the other person, don't focus on their negative. This is a fellow Jew. How do you tear them down? They're so holy, they're so special. I want to share with you two very beautiful stories that depict this. One story involves Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, himself a concentration camp survivor, and he wrote the following story that happened with him. He was in a concentration camp when one of the prisoners, or a new prisoner, had smuggled in a siddur, a prayer book, into the concentration camp. And Simon Wiesenthal considered him a hero for doing so, until he saw that what this person was doing the smuggler was doing, is that he allowed people to use his siddur for 15 minutes in exchange for 1/4 of their day's meager ration. That's what he did. He used the siddur as a barter to get more food. And although the inmates were emaciated, they did it. They traded in their portions for the siddur. In time, the siddur owner himself died before everyone because all the extra food that he was eating, he couldn't handle, and it killed him. After the war, Simon Wiesenthal found himself in a displaced persons camp, and that camp was visited by Rabbi Eliezer Silver Zatzal, who after the war went around displaced persons camps to speak to Jews, to organize minyanim for them, and to speak with them. And he found out that Simon Wiesenthal did not attend the minyan, the service that he had made. And he went to visit Simon Wiesenthal. And Rabbi Silver came over to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, "So they tell me that you're angry at God." So Simon responded, "No, not with God, but with one of his servants." And he told Rabbi Silver the whole story with the siddur smuggler. And Rabbi Silver kept smiling and said, "Is that all you have to tell me?" And Simon says, "Rebbe, isn't that enough?" And he said to him with a smile, "So you look only at the man who took something. Why don't you look instead at the men who gave something?" He touched me with it, and with that he gave Simon a tap, and he left. The lesson was, why are you looking at the person who took? Why aren't you looking at all the people who gave away their meager portion, part of the meager portion, to daven from a siddur? So Simon wrote that ever since then, after that, he went to the services the next day. And ever since, he tried to remember there are two sides to every problem. But there's more to than just two sides to every problem. It means focus on the positive. Why you just focus on the negative? It's something that we tend to do. But why focus on that one negative person when there is so much more good going on? And that's how I have to look at every person. There's so much good there. And if you don't see it, it's potential, and it's great potential. It's a neshama. Cherish it. Rabbi Dr. Avraham Twersky tells the following story. Rabbi Dr. Twersky had started a rehab for drug addicts in Pittsburgh. He's a world-renowned psychiatrist dealing with drug addiction. And he was once in Israel. And actually, let me back up. He tells a story with Reb Shalom Dev of Lubavitch, who showed great affection for simple people. Simple people. Showed some tremendous affection. And one time a chassid of his, who was a diamond dealer, asked the Rebbe what does he see in these simple, unlearned people? What does he see in them that he cherishes them so much? So the rabbi asked his chassid whether he had any of his merchandise, any of his diamonds on him. And the chassid took out a packet of diamonds and showed it to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe pointed to a large gem and said, "That's a beautiful diamond." The chassid smiled and he said, "No, Rebbe, it happens to be full of defects. But it's more beautiful than the other stones," he said. The chassid explained, "It happens to be larger than the other stones, but because it has defects, which can be seen with a magnifying glass, its value is much less. Now here is a smaller stone that may not appear as brilliant as the larger one, but it's a perfect stone, and it's very valuable." You see, Rebbe, to know the value of diamonds, you have to be a maven, you have to be an expert. I understand, the Rebbe said, but the same thing is true of knowing the value of people, where you also have to be a maven to appreciate and to know the true value of people. That's the starting story that Rabbi Twersky brings. Then he brings a story that happened personally with him when he was in Israel, on a project in Israel to rehabilitate ex-convicts who had been drug addicts. And in the meeting, he tried to point out to them that people who have a strong sense of self-worth are unlikely to do things to harm them. Just like if you own a car, a beautiful car, if you realize the value of the car, you take care of it. People who realize their own self-value don't hurt themselves. So one of the clients, a 34-year-old, got up and told Rabbi Twersky, "You expect me to have a sense of self-worth? I'm 34 years old, and I've spent 16 years of my life in prison. When I get out of jail, no one wants to hire me because of my record. So I can't get a job to support myself. My family, when they hear that I'm released, are very upset. They don't want to see me. They'd rather see me dead. How could I possibly have a feeling of self-worth?" So Rabbi Twersky was taken back by this man's desperation. And he said to him, he said, "Avi," that was the man's name, "have you ever seen a display in a jeweler's window? There are dazzling diamonds worth many thousands of dollars. Now, a diamond," he says, "comes from a diamond mine. If you've ever been to a diamond mine, you would see things that look like little pieces of glass in dirt. And you would say to someone, 'What do you bother with all these dirty pieces of glass for?' And if someone were to take out a big piece of glass, really dirty, and you'd say to him, 'Get rid of it, it's just a piece of dirt.' And the person would say, 'No. I'm going to send this to be processed.' And it comes back a beautiful 15-carat diamond. And the person says to you, this is just something that they didn't make it, they didn't turn it into this beautiful thing. It always was beautiful, it just has to be processed, has to be cleansed. Avi," he said, "you are telling me that you're worthless. But I'm a maven. I have the expertise, and I can see the precious diamond within you. If you stay with us, we'll help you reveal it." And he stayed on. He stayed on for treatment for 3 months, went to a halfway house, got a job, continued to work on his recovery, and eventually moved to independent living. One day, the administrator of the halfway house called Avi that she needed someone to get a truck and pick up furniture from a family that had called up the halfway house. Their mother had passed away, and they wanted to donate the furniture to the halfway house. They needed someone to come pick it up. So the administrator asked Avi if he could pick it up. And he said yes. Got hold of a truck, drove down to the house, called up the administrator and told her that this furniture is so dilapidated, there's nothing you can do with it. She told him, put it into the truck anyway. I don't want to refuse a donation, and you'll bring it here and we'll get rid of it. So he said, okay. As he's schlepping a large sofa, an old sofa, out from behind one of the pillows falls an envelope. And in the envelope, there are 5,000 shekel. 5,000 shekel. Now here's Avi. Here he has a chance for an envelope of 5,000 shekel. What did he do? He called up the family, told them about the envelope. The family was very taken back, and they told him to donate the money to the halfway house. Later on, Dr. Twersky met Avi, and Avi told him the story. And to that, Dr. Twersky said, "Didn't I tell you that you were a beautiful diamond, that there was a beautiful diamond within you? How many otherwise honest people would simply have pocketed the money and not said a word about it? Your diamond is brilliant, Avi." It's another example of even a person in the worst of situation, but there's still a diamond within them. That's how we have to look at every person. The Torah tells us, don't speak Lashon Hara, don't speak disparagingly about anyone. And even if you didn't even hurt them, and maybe you know you're not going to hurt them, nonetheless, every person's a diamond. How can you tear it down? How can you blemish it? How can you not cherish it? That's the lesson of Lashon Hara. The lesson of understanding every Jew is a gem. A gem. I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. Take care and be safe.